Do you remember this?
Well, you don't need to worry. There'll be days like this.
Or maybe this.
A child arrived just the other day.
Throughout the late 80s and 90s, the British government made over 25 adverts like these.
But it's sure nice talking to you, Dad.
It was an attempt to win the hearts and minds of the Northern Irish public and end the violence of the Troubles.
Wow. Look out. Use the confidential telephone.
Every advertising trick in the book was used, and they provide fascinating snapshots of our brutal past.
They are shocking. That is a price that has to be paid.
And our aspirations for the future.
Wouldn't it be great if it was like this all the time?
This is the complex and controversial story of how a series of public service commercials attempted to dominate the war of ideas and change the course of history.
The real battleground is in here.
The whole point of the adverts was to demonize. The government has the right to encourage people to save lives.
They were writing and making propaganda.
It was the truth.
Propaganda.
It was the truth.
Propaganda. It was the truth.
It's January 1988, and a Northern Ireland office commercial called A Future is being broadcast for the first time.
All my life, people have hated the police and army. I was reared in streets filled with their guns.
It tells the story of a young man pondering the effects of paramilitary violence on his life.
And when something really rough happened, I'd just train harder to forget it. Anything for a quiet life, see?
Later on, we'll play the commercial in full and get some reactions from people you might recognise.
I know I should be looking at this ad in the context of January 1988, and all I can see is Billy Mitchell.
And from members of the public you won't.
That's so polite. You know, RBR outside.
But first, the story of this advert and how it nearly didn't get made at all begins 12 months previously. It's 1987. What we euphemistically refer to as the Troubles has been raging for about 20 years. There's little sign that it's ever coming to an end.
The IRA shot and killed a part-time member of the Ulster Defence Regiment.
The body of a 40-year-old taxi driver has been found.
2 policemen shot dead in a Belfast bar last night. The IRA says it shot them.
We'll be bringing you more news about that explosion as we get it on BBC One throughout the evening.
Northern Ireland was a bleak place at that time. We were probably 2 notches away from civil war.
John Irvine was working as a young reporter for UTV.
The Ulster Television newsroom was a very busy place at that time. It's one of the only newsrooms I know that didn't have a planning desk because one wasn't required. The paramilitaries and the security forces were providing news for us overnight, every night and every day. Sadly, and most of that news was very grim.
1987 was the first of many British Army postings for Tim Collins.
It's hard to imagine a time when both sides were more entrenched. The Ulster Says No campaign had been going on. The IRA was in the ascendancy, although they'd had a serious setback in 1987 with the Loch Gall encounter with Special Forces.
It seems undercover troops were lying in wait for the IRA attackers. The soldiers...
It was at that period, of course, that the American-funded arms shipments and the Colonel Gaddafi shipments had arrived.
Among the weapons were surface-to-air missiles, and there's growing speculation they were intended for the IRA.
Sinn Féin officially refused to take part in this film. But we did speak to Sinn Féin's former Director of Publicity, Danny Morrison.
In late 1987, the British intelligence services that were then able to work out that the IRA were well armed and could fight on for a considerable period of time. So there was certainly no light at the end of the tunnel. All sides felt that they were behind the trenches.
Amidst this tense atmosphere, the British government decided to create a confidential phone line to encourage people to report suspicious activity. As the line was untraceable on phone bills, the security forces hoped they would get extra intelligence in the fight against loyalist and Republican paramilitary groups. But getting people to use the phone line was going to be difficult. In many areas, the British presence was deeply resented. Tim Brannigan grew up just off the Falls Road in Belfast.
I grew up around the corner in a big Republican family, and one of my favourite slogans was written on the wall around the corner there, and it just used to say, "The IRA rule Beachmount." And I used to look at it and see and feel a sense that they're protecting us, and if it wasn't for them, the British Army and the cops and unionism would still have its foot on our neck, so to speak.
In County Tyrone, William Matchett was working as a uniformed officer for the RUC. He witnessed firsthand the extreme hatred felt by some towards the police and army.
I'll never forget, it was a small stray dog, and it used to follow the army. The army would give it bits and pieces, you know, food, so would we. And we went out the next day and it hung the dog, which is like, the dog was obviously an army sympathiser, the dog was a Brit. In some areas, that's the level of hatred was out there. Essentially, when you put the uniform on, all the scene was that uniform. They didn't see a person. You became a non-person.
The government realised they needed not only to promote the confidential phone line, but also change attitudes. The person given this difficult job was Andy Wood. He was Director of Information at the Northern Ireland office.
Well, the initial push was an idea by Tom King, which I don't think he'd really thought through, which was that we, the Northern Ireland office, or government generally, could make a film promoting, frankly, lauding the army and the RUC, and that we would then get the BBC to show it just like that.
Don Anderson was working for television regulator, the Independent Broadcasting Authority.
The BBC said, we can't be seen to be doing something like this. It'll make us out as an agent of government. We can't do this.
It was obviously not thought through as an idea. I mean, the idea of editorial control and freedom didn't seem to come into his thinking. I went to the BBC and got the knockback I expected.
The documentary was abandoned, but a better idea soon emerged. They would make an advert instead.
Because it would be an advertisement as opposed to a quasi-documentary, we would have control over when it was aired and how it was aired and how it was made. We would be commissioning editors for an advertisement, as simple as that.
At this time, David Lyle was at the advertising agency McCann Erickson. This was a brief that would transform his career.
A letter came out and it said that the government wished to run a campaign to promote the confidential telephone, and it wished to do this as a way of winning community support for the process of supporting the security forces and ensuring that information would flow that would help to save lives.
The advert, A Future, was scheduled for January 1988. But first, like all commercials, it had to get approval from the Independent Broadcasting Authority, the IBA. This wasn't a given for Andy Wood nor the Northern Ireland office, because the IBA had strict guidelines and overtly political advertising was banned.
Andy certainly told me that he'd had conversations with the IBA and they were telling him, look, we're worried about these. We think these may technically be against the law.
It was fit to go. Now, first transmission was, I think, a Monday evening on UTV, and on the Friday evening, the previous Friday, I went to a dinner at the IBA offices here in Northern Ireland, and the then boss of the IBA took me on one side and suggested, or worried rather, that this might not be quite the right time to be showing this sort of advert.
What he was actually saying was perhaps never is the time. The question then became, were these advertisements political? This was a fear inside the IBA. Andy's retort to that would have been, no, they aren't political. And Andy would have meant they weren't party political. The IBA was worried that they were political small p. And this was the ground on which the battle was fought. But in the end, the IBA retreated on the basis that it was unlikely
there are going to be any people ready to challenge these ads in the court. It's as simple as that.
And so, A Future was broadcast as planned in January 1988. Before we hear from our panel, here it is, completely uninterrupted, for the first time in full since it last aired in living rooms 30 years ago.
All my life, people have hated the police and the army. I was reared in streets filled with their guns, so I've always looked the other way when the lads were having a go. Who cares, I thought. And when something really rough happened, I'd just train harder to forget it. Anything for a quiet life, see? But where's it got me? What have these hard men done for me? They've left me with no job and no hope. They've wrecked where I live. They've hijacked our cars, fed off our backs. And when I saw their kind of justice, I thought, there's gotta be something better than this. So I made up my mind. I want the hoods off my back. I phoned that confidential telephone number and told them what I know. You see, I want a decent future, and that's not gonna happen while these heroes are screwing it up for everybody.
It's actually really sad watching some of that. I feel kind of sorry for us.
I didn't really know how it would make me feel, but I wasn't expecting that. But you see, seeing the shotgun and that again, and I mean, I'd seen people being shot. And I mean, they didn't annoy me at all whenever they were on. I don't even know why I'm reacting like someone was a bit embarrassed, but I suppose it's just a fear that it would go back to that as well.
I don't remember that seeming as cruel as that.
I remember it well.
Is it shocking? No, it's not shocking. I remember that this ad had an effect because it showed a kneecapping, and you wouldn't have seen anything like that represented on screen before.
It's very didactic. I shouldn't laugh because it is a very serious period of time, but that looks like it was put together by numbers, sort of, let's have a bomb, let's have a shooting, and let's have somebody looking dead serious and tell the camera and saying the troubles are bad, aren't they?
I always, in my head, for some reason, always thought he was a Protestant, and that was because he had a job. We didn't really have any jobs to lose, to be honest.
1988 was the year I was born, so looking at the baby at the end of the thing, that realistically could have been me or any of my friends. So it is a bit freaky looking at the ad, kind of going, God, this was the society that you were born into, and it wasn't exactly the most normal place in the world to be brought up.
The bomb went off as crowds of local people were gathering.
Police say the bomb was designed to murder civilians.
Back in 1988, the original audience for A Future was still reeling from the IRA Remembrance Day bombing in Enniskillen, which killed 12 people.
Of the 63 people injured, 13 were children aged between 2 and 15.
Clearly A Future script was written before the Enniskillen bombing in November 1987. The Enniskillen tragedy was incorporated into A Future in the edit. There's a scene from the Enniskillen bomb in the TV set towards the end of the ad. And it undoubtedly created a different context.
I think the Enniskillen bombing was unique in that people who had become apathetic, people who had become desensitised, who turned over the television when those types of events were being reported, were shocked at the carnage, were shocked at the death, and really then began to say, this can't go on, we have to find a solution.
That helped to create, I think, a more receptive mood for A Future when it was launched in January '88.
A Future kick-started a campaign that would run for 5 years, featuring a variety of adverts using a mixture of techniques, all condemning violence and promoting the confidential phone line.
Help the police to help us all.
How effective the early adverts were in convincing people to give information will always be debated. There are no official response figures.
When I'm watching ads and they're saying lift the phone and tell anything, you know, my answer to him was off, you know. That's not happening.
A Future did increase useful calls. That was a good sign that it was making progress. I call it the slow burn.
I don't know, would anybody have picked up the phone and rang the confidential telephone line that wouldn't have done that anyway? That's the question.
Someone who lifts the phone to inform on a friend or a relative or a neighbour, when that friend, relative and neighbour is a member of a community which has been suffering, which has been oppressed, which has been discriminated against, for them to do that is betrayal of the highest order. And I mean, it was painted up on the walls. I remember growing up as a child, you know, informers will be shot.
Anyone living in West Belfast knows that the consequence for informing is death.
In 1990, Tim Brannigan was sent to jail after someone told the police that he was holding weapons for the IRA.
In my case, it was actually a 17-year-old boy who was the informer, and he did get shot by the IRA in what I would now view as a sort of Taliban-type response. He was shot in the elbows, knees and ankles. But I was really relieved that, unlike a lot of informers, he wasn't shot dead. I was lying in jail, nothing to do with me. The IRA were punishing him no matter what. My personal feelings on the matter.
Of course, the adverts weren't just about the phone line. The government brief was also to increase support for the security services.
The crucial thing about this film in 1988, and what clearly comes through, is the same thing. They had a revelation in Iraq with the U.S. Marine Corps, is that it's crime, not war. The key was to make people see these weren't your combatants, these were criminals.
It's turning around going, essentially, this is the good ideology. This is the rule of law that people in this society should support. We know it's difficult to do that in the current situation, but this is what you should do. Phone this number. That was attacking everything that the provisional movement stood for, because they were legitimizing murder. They were turning around and go, in these circumstances, it's okay to murder a police officer, a judge, or anyone who opposes us, because our ideology says so.
Billy Hutchinson is now the leader of the Progressive Unionist Party. Until his release in 1990, he was the UVF leader in Longcash Prison.
The whole point of the adverts was to demonise, and the whole point of British control over anybody was that you always make out the people who are involved in the conflict or the war as bad people. You know, they're totally dehumanised, you know, and that's what they do.
Last year they killed and killed and killed again.
In this propaganda battle, the confidential phone line was presented as neutral.
Together, we can all help to stop them.
But many people would have viewed it differently. David Miller carried out an extensive study of how the Troubles were portrayed in the media.
The British clearly were an active player in the conflict. There's a kind of ideology going on there, which is that Britain's only holding the ring, Britain's the kind of superior civilised force trying to get the Irish to sort themselves out. And that's part of the story they're trying to tell.
Violence just didn't come from one community. The state itself was involved not only in violence, but perhaps in legal murder, conspiracy to murder. These films consistently distort the depiction of the conflict.
It's 1992.
The start of what could be one of the most dramatic and exciting election nights since the war.
Sectarian violence is still very much part of life.
What is to be done in Northern Ireland? Where the cry grows up, will it end?
5 Catholics were shot dead by 2 UFF gunmen.
The confidential phone line ads have been running for 4 years now, and the Northern Ireland office has decided to ramp things up with a new campaign. David Lyle is now working closely with Julianne Bailey. She would be integral in developing a new, more nuanced approach.
There was absolutely no point in us just capturing the moral high ground. That was never going to be enough. Popularising the security forces, never going to be enough. Demonising terrorists wasn't going to work. This had to be something brand new and different, and that's why we developed the psychological strategy that we did.
Central to their pitch was extensive research that they commissioned, which contained a detailed analysis of the public's attitude towards terrorism. It was this research that allowed them to identify their core target audiences.
At the heart of this analysis, of course, are terrorists. We would have regarded them as the hardest nut to crack. Then the core support base of the terrorists were the next group. They were the people who fully approved of what the paramilitaries were doing in their community. And then in the outer ring, the most peripheral of the target audiences were mainstream decent people. The vast majority of the population, both Protestant and Catholic, who were totally disapproving of all paramilitary organisations. Now, we had to actually reinforce to them the fact that terrorism was not winning and that terrorism was a lost cause, but we also had to undermine the confidence of the terrorists themselves and show them that what they were doing would have catastrophic consequences. Each of those target audiences was in the frame.
The pitch did reflect a newer, different direction, less mechanical. The first one was about, this is how to do something about it, and this is, don't keep on doing this. That phase 2.
Getting the right psychological approach was crucial. One cold morning outside Crumlin Road Jail, as the pair observed wives and children visiting prisoners held inside, they had a revelation.
So different from standing there on that day when we watched the mothers queuing up with the children.
And it was very poignant, and the pathos was dreadful when you see little children being taken in to see their dads.
I just remember them queuing up along that railing with their little lunch boxes.
That gave us such a profound insight to the reality of what terrorism was doing to families. Because of the research we did, because we went into prisons and we watched and observed and listened and took on board what we would find out, we realised that the most powerful thing of all in a terrorist prisoner's life was his family.
It was decided to make 3 high-end production mini-films at a total cost of nearly £1 million.
Don't suffer it. Change it. Call the confidential telephone.
The adverts were called Car Wash, Lady.
From this day forward, till death do us part, death do us part.
And most famously, this one, I Want to Be Like You, Dad, which told the story of a father and son through the lyrics of a song by Harry Chapin. Here's the advert in full, and just to warn you, it does contain graphic scenes of violence.
A child arrived just the other day. He came to the world in the usual way. But there were planes to catch and bills to pay. He learned to walk while I was away, and he was talking for I knew it. And as he grew, he'd say, I'm gonna be like you, Dad. You know I'm gonna be like you. And the cat's in the cradle and a silver spoon. Little boy blue and the man in the moon. When you're coming home, Daddy, don't know when, but we'll get together then. Well, my son turned 10 just the other day. He said, thanks for the ball, Dad, come on, let's play. Can you teach me to throw? I said, not today, I got a lot to do. He said, that's okay, and he walked away, but his smile never dipped. It said, I'm gonna be like him. You know I'm gonna be like him. Well, I've long since retired, my son's moved away. I called him up just the other day. I said I'd like to see you if you don't mind. He said I'd love to, Dad, if I could find the time. You see, my new job's a hassle and the kids have the flu, but it's sure nice talking to you, Dad. It's been sure nice talking to you. And as I hung up the phone, it occurred to me he'd grown up just like me. My boy was just like me. And the cat's in the cradle and a silver spoon.
Don't suffer it. Change it. Call the confidential telephone.
When you're coming home, son, I don't know when, but we'll get together then, Dad.
Free phone 0800 666 999. Anything you know can help.
Gonna have a good time then.
Wow. That's a bloody good ad when you look back on it. That's a really good ad.
Sorry, I'm very tearful.
It's a terrible watch. I mean, I actually feel my heart beating really fast.
There's no holding back. The gunfire there is so explicit. The bloodshed and the damage.
It was very realistic.
Very realistic.
Yeah. I think the genius of that is the story and the song, because you start to identify with the people in it.
At the time, I didn't even twig. It wasn't that they were directed at Catholics or Protestant. They were directed at the working class. But we were all more interested about getting in university than we were about getting into the RA. But stigmatising the working class, that's where the troubles all came from. No, that's not my experience at all.
I'm pretty sure that even at the time, I thought it was a bit sentimental and overblown. But then, of course, I didn't have kids back then. You see in all these ads the attempt to play on the fears of how your children will turn out. Which is very effective on a parent, even if you're not raising your children to be paramilitaries.
Now there is an irony, of course, when people all these ads asking people to use the confidential telephone number and all of that. When we now know 20 years on that all these organisations were riddled top to bottom with spies and informers and touts and agents and what have you. And in fact, if there are 3 people in a car going to murder somebody, 2 of them are probably informers. So maybe no point ringing the confidential telephone line. Bet you that bit doesn't go out.
I do believe that we must all collectively suffer from some kind of post-traumatic stress disorder. Probably mainly triggered now by Harry Chapin singing The Cat's in the Cradle.
And the cat's in the cradle and a silver spoon.
Don't suffer it. Change it. Call the confidential telephone.
When you're coming home, son, I don't know when, but we'll get together then, Dad.
The new campaign was launched on the 7th of July 1993. Much to the delight of everyone involved, it even made the news.
The 3 commercials were launched today by the Secretary of State and the new Security Minister.
They are intended to demonstrate the reality of terrorism. They are shocking. That is a price that has to be paid.
They were also getting positive feedback from the security forces.
There is evidence to show that the confidential hotline, which the RUC have operated now for many years, is successful. This builds on that success.
Anything you know can help.
There was a 729% increase in useful or genuine calls to the confidential telephone. Imagine a brand manager for any big brand like Coca-Cola or Adidas got any kind of response like that. It was overwhelming.
It wasn't aimed at resolving the conflict through negotiation, through discussion, through compromise. It was aimed at inform on your community. I don't believe for a second they felt that they were doing good. They felt that they were taking part. They were fighting their side of the war, and this is the way they did it.
While the new campaign did encourage use of the confidential phone line, its focus was also more targeted than the previous ads. Lady tells the emotional story of 2 women from different backgrounds whose husbands are involved in the conflict. Once again, be prepared for some violent scenes.
Dancing behind masks. Whatever lonely hearts can hide. Lady, 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 don't walk me slow.
2 women, 2 traditions, 2 tragedies. One married to the victim of violence, one married to the prisoner of violence. Both scarred, both suffering, both desperately wanting it to stop. Don't suffer it. Change it. Call the confidential telephone. Free phone 0800 666 999. Anything you know can help.
It was absolutely a conscious decision to target females in this campaign, and that was very different from anything that had happened in the past. Paramilitarism, terrorism, it was this big macho territory, and people were forgetting that women were hugely significant.
For security reasons, filming for all 3 adverts in the campaign took place in Glasgow. But they did also risk filming in some key local locations, including this one, Hollywood Pier. Locations like this were chosen for maximum impact.
Yeah, I remember us selecting Hollywood Pier just with the whole backdrop of Belfast behind.
It's a great location.
And the very lonely image of the girl.
It's a very forlorn image and a very evocative image, but it's also a great location, you know, because it's, you know, on Belfast Lough, you know, which is...
Well, it rooted it here, and it was one of the few locations we could use in Northern Ireland.
Locations encode emotional memory. If you get good locations, people therefore are able to place moments, emotions, moods with particular visual images. And there's something about the rickety nature of the pier itself which kind of captures something about the fragility of life, the fragility of her life, the way she's been left alone.
Ladies' focus was wives. I Want to Be Like You, Dad targeted husbands. But at the core of both films was a psychological theory that they believed held the key to their most important target audiences. It's known as cognitive dissonance.
As human beings, we are not comfortable with holding 2 conflicting ideas at one time. And so what the induction of cognitive dissonance does is to bring into conflict things that are inside people so that they work out for themselves that they've got to resolve the conflict. If you take someone in a paramilitary organisation who loves his cause, and you let that person discover that that love of paramilitary violence will destroy the other thing you love most in your life, which is your family, then that dissonance has to be resolved. And that's what we did.
So when people were presented with these conflicting ideas, what happens is they moderate the way they think, and of course ultimately they change their attitudes and they change their behaviours.
Someone like me, I didn't see myself as a victim, but I seen my mother as a victim. My mother was the person who had to deal with what I had done. She had to live in the community. You know, she had to come to terms with losing her baby. Like, you know, even though I was 18 when I went to prison, I'm still her baby. These adverts, actually, for the first time for me, had started to say that there's 2 sides to this.
There was a scene where people come up to visit people in jail. And I was seeing that any time I went on a visit, and I was seeing lads going out who had 25 years, and I remember thinking, your kids are going to be adults by the time you get out. The world is going to be so different for you. And I saw the weariness in some of the visitors when they were coming up, women who had 3 and 4 kids and were surviving on no money, coming up to see a husband who'd been in jail 5 years but still had another 15 to go. Some of it resonated. It might have been when people went back to their cells and thought about it at night, but it formed part of the atmosphere in which you assessed your life.
The mean score for interest was in and around 85 to 90.
In the battle for hearts and minds, the ad makers were about to add another weapon to their arsenal. Fiona Rooney was studying applied psychology at Queen's University when she watched I Want to Be Like You, Dad on television. What she saw was the perfect application for a revolutionary new technique called real-time response testing.
Nothing of this nature had ever been done before on any ad in Northern Ireland. We were measuring people's immediate second-by-second reaction as they viewed the stimulus in front of them.
So these are our original charts.
If we look at the interest score, the entire ad is between 80 and 100% in terms of level of interest.
Today, we are recreating the original test with a group of people too young to remember the advert. They've no idea why they're being brought in or what they're watching. All we're testing is their immediate response. Positive and negative reactions are measured by moving a fader from left to right.
Emotion drives everything. That's the basis upon which we exist in the world. In the second that you feel something, before your brain has time to process that, you have an emotional reaction, and that produces a physical reaction, and that is key to collecting the information in terms of how exactly people are emotionally reacting to what they're seeing right in front of them.
All future adverts were tested, tweaked and retested in this way to maximize emotional responses. But what about today's guinea pigs? How did their response compare with the tests carried out in 1993?
These results are from the group today, and we can see the results are really very, very interesting.
So a lot of involvement.
A lot of interest right from the very beginning.
I do kind of know about the troubles from just asking questions from my granny and my parents, and I know that it was a hard time.
So they're gripped in exactly the same places as they were over 20 years ago?
They are indeed. We can see here one of the highest peaks is at the first murder.
We haven't seen that in our lifetime. I think we've moved on a lot from those times.
You wouldn't have thought it was from Northern Ireland 30, 40 years ago. It seems like something just so obsolete and so different.
Right to the very end, where "Don't Suffer a Change" it appears on the screen, we see a very high level of interest.
And it's a brand that isn't relevant to them today.
Well, I suppose it didn't really seem like real life, but I know it has happened, but just never really gave it much thought.
Gathering response data like this was vital, but the ads weren't just playing out in laboratory conditions. They played out in living rooms, amongst soaps, quiz shows, but also news reports.
The Shankill Road was busy with lunchtime shoppers when the attack happened.
3 months after the new campaign launch, the IRA exploded a bomb on the Shankill Road.
The bomb exploded without warning.
We've seen a woman there and her head bashed in, her arm off.
The people of Northern Ireland want peace. From the point of view of the authorities, the improving relationship and the improved security successes continue. They're not good enough yet, but we must carry on with them.
A week later, Loyalist gunmen spread the Rising Sun bar in grey steel with gunfire.
Bullet holes litter one part of the lounge area.
2 men came in and said, "Trick or treat," then sprayed the whole place with bullets.
27 people died that October, making it the bloodiest month of the Troubles in 17 years. The Northern Ireland office responded by giving the campaign a push and buying extra airtime.
In these ads, rather than terrorists simply being depicted as the bad guys, in fact, in many ways, they're depicted as victims of circumstance. Their faces can register sadness, anguish, love and pain. And that is a markedly different depiction of what's going on in Northern Ireland to what has gone before.
If in the context of today, similar advertisements began to appear in the United Kingdom, which sought to humanize, if you like, the people who were responsible for 7/7 in London, the massacre there, the people responsible for the bombing in Manchester, I think there'd be a mighty, mighty eruption.
We now know that the ad makers' attempts at humanizing the conflict were part of a bigger government strategy.
We don't know if the people who did the adverts or the people in charge of press relations and media and communications at the Northern Ireland office knew any of this, but at the very same time, the British government was sitting down in secret with the IRA and Sinn Féin and was trying to work out a way to move towards a peace process.
I can't remember the phrase. It's called taking the evidence afterwards and making it fit what went before. Life ain't as tidy as that.
So there wasn't a meeting where someone said, right, we're going to be talking to terrorists and you need to make them more human?
If there was, I certainly wasn't there and I would have expected to be there. No, no.
Uh-oh, we're in trouble. Something's come along and it's burst our bubble. Yeah.
It's August 1994.
Gotta get home quick, march on the double.
1 year on from the last campaign launch, and the IRA has just declared a ceasefire.
As of midnight, August the 31st, there will be a complete cessation of military operations.
Some politicians are questioning whether or not this is a permanent end to the IRA's campaign.
I remember being there on the day the ceasefire was announced at Sinn Féin's headquarters in Andersonstown, Connolly House, and there was champagne and carnations and all sorts of celebrations going on.
All of a sudden, it wasn't a body count anymore. All of a sudden, it was arguing over the meanings of what's the word permanent mean.
I want them to make clear what they have been intimating is the case, that they have ended violence for good.
Just over a month later, loyalist groups would call their own ceasefire.
At midnight tonight, the Loyalist paramilitaries will cease fire.
There will now have to be unprecedented changes of attitude combined with respect for the families of the victims.
Could this mean the fighting was over?
I'll admit I cried, and it was tears of joy. I actually thought that this was it, nothing more to do, it was over. But, you know, we quickly learned that it wasn't all over.
In response to the ceasefires, a new ad was rushed out. It was called Time to Build.
For too long we've all been prisoners of the past. But now is the time to change.
There was a new mood. It was a real mood of optimism.
The time to live.
That's when we created the Time to Build ad.
The time to build.
The time to be born, the time to grow, the time to reap, the time to sow, the time to build, the time to choose, the time to live, the time to heal.
Now is the time to help the police keep the peace. The time to trust. The time to build.
Turn, 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 the Birds song, the music license for that was held by Pete Seeger. And we got in touch with his agents, and the word came back, you can use it for free worldwide. I won't charge you a thing because I'm so impressed by what's happening in Northern Ireland.
This sounded the possibility of a future. I mean, the first one we talked about from 1988 was called A Future. I want a future. And this is the future. It can be sunny days when flowers can bloom where previously there were only derelict shops and bombs. That's the argument, isn't it? And you know, there was a very substantial degree of support for that argument.
In 1995, with the ceasefire still in place, the Northern Ireland office began its most ambitious campaign yet. 11 adverts costing a total of over £2 million. If previous adverts had helped end the war, then maybe these new adverts could help keep the peace.
The next wave of advertising that I was involved with were meant to show that there was a lighter side to life here, that you could have a laugh.
An American flies into Belfast to look at a new factory. Passing Stormont, he says, wow, how many people working there? The driver says, about half of them on a good day.
Did they create the mood? Not of themselves. Did they reinforce the mood? Yeah, quite possibly. I think they probably did. Did they push it along? I don't know. I guess they probably did.
Have I told you lately that I love you?
Respecting each other's differences doesn't mean losing your own. That was the line we put on the end of one of the ads. We can learn to share and respect.
And we had a scene with this man walking up the Belfast hills, and he had 2 greyhounds with him. This was just representing normal life. And I remember kind of just a bit cheekily and just for a bit of fun thinking, okay, we're going to put a green muzzle in one and an orange muzzle in the other, which we did. And I've often wondered how many people noticed.
Who the hell are you to tell me that I can have? Of course I can have my own aspirations. I don't need an NIO advert to tell me that it's okay to have my aspirations. You know, and this is, and they were seen as
he said, Van really wants you to listen to this new song. It hasn't been released yet. It's called Days Like This, and it may well work with just the whole mood of your campaign.
We wrote the script Boys against Days Like This, you know, and that story became one of the most compelling stories of that series of ads.
It certainly affected my appreciation of Van Morrison.
When there's no one complaining.
Just think it might have been nice if Van Morrison had behaved a bit more like Pete Seeger when it came to waiving perhaps some of the licence fee.
Well, my mama told me there'd be days like this.
The advert Boys was central to that campaign. It depicted two children from different backgrounds playing in the sand dunes.
Somewhere over here.
It is the area. We're definitely in the area.
This time it wasn't filmed secretly in the back alleys of Glasgow, but on the North Antrim coast, including here at Port Ballantrae.
Such a contrast to the other locations that we worked in, which had to be gritty and grimy and gloomy and grey, and we were here in this fabulous sunshine.
That's right.
And of course, this is the beach where Days Like This, the music track for the whole peace process, was born.
Yes. It became the anthem for that whole summer of peace.
There'll be days like this.
So here it is, the advert Boys from 1995 in full.
When it's not always raining, there'll be days like this. When there's no one complaining, there'll be days like this. Everything falls into place like the flick of a switch. Well, my mama told me there'll be days like this. When you don't need to worry, there'll be days like this. When no one's in a hurry, there'll be days like this. When you don't get betrayed by that old Judas kiss. Oh, my mama told me there'll be days like this. When everyone is up front and they're not playing tricks. When you don't have no freeloaders out to get their kicks. Well, that's nobody's business, the way that you want to live. I'll just have to remember there'll be days like this.
My first thought about that is too, it's a Protestant boy and a little Catholic boy, isn't it lovely? And I go, where are their parents?
What a stinking block of cheese this was, and it hasn't got any better with time.
I can't say what I thought of that one, because it was pure bollocks.
When you're watching this, you realise that the problem the director must have had, how can we show that one of these kids is Catholic and one is Protestant? And they have this ridiculous exchange of badges. I can make out a King Billy badge from one, whatever that is. And I had to stop the video to find out that that's a GAA badge of some description and a match ticket, I think. How crass. Could they not just have made the Catholic one ginger?
Wouldn't it be great, a Protestant and a Catholic? Why can't it all be like Curry Mila? Because it's not like Curry Mila, that's why.
I remember being completely taken by it. I adored it. This ad, to me, is of a golden time.
Actually, at the time, I think it suited the mood very well, you know. There was a sense of self-respect.
We're not going to traumatise you anymore. We're going to say, you know what? Life can be good when it stops raining.
This sunnier, optimistic atmosphere was boosted by American President Bill Clinton's visit in November 1995.
We remain Americans and the people of Northern Ireland, partners for security, partners for prosperity, and most important, partners for peace.
The same night he switched on the Christmas tree lights at Belfast City Hall, Van Morrison played a concert with Brian Kennedy. The songs from the peace ads rang out, including Days Like This.
Our politicians were trying to do something that was completely alien to them, and that was to go down the path of peace towards a political agreement. And while the Clinton administration may not have been closely involved in the negotiations, what his visits did was validate what our politicians were trying to do. You know, they were uncertain, feeling their way. And of course, the ad campaign again validated what they were trying to do. and helped convince the Northern Ireland public that what was going on was positive and could lead to a sunnier upland.
The American stuff coming here gave us a bit of a mood, and it was a good mood, but I'm not so sure how much of this actually plays out on the ground, you know, in working class communities, but at least it's good advertising. You know, you pay a fortune to get Bill Clinton to appear in your advert.
I think the word is synergy, isn't it? Advertisers love it. It's a synergy.
Of course, there wasn't always synergy. The following year, the IRA ceasefire was dramatically broken with bombs in London and then Manchester.
The IRA's England campaign have shaken an already fragile peace process here to its foundations.
The Loyalist ceasefire held, but that July, Drumcree was once again a flashpoint, and peace still seemed a long way off. In March 1997, the advert Time Bomb was released.
Do you know where you're going to? Do you like the things that life is showing you?
Do you like the things that life is showing you? And we had to remind people that whilst we'd come a huge long way, you know, we weren't there yet. Atrocities had happened. There were some horrific events that had happened.
Civil unrest rocked the province last night on a scale not seen in many years.
And we had to come in there with hard-hitting ads again. We had to remind people about the massive amount that they had to lose.
Leg injuries after being beaten by a gang of men wielding iron bars and baseball bats.
A West Belfast teenager crucified to a wooden fence with metal spikes to his knees and elbows last week. There have been angry scenes at Drumcree within the past half hour.
A crowd of about 400 stopped mass from taking place in Harryville last
And workers forced out of their jobs.
The victim was attacked at a house.
It's a miracle no one was killed on being. The Ballinahinch bomb blast was an attempt at mass murder.
London and Dublin were very worried about Northern Ireland slipping backwards, and this was an attempt to deny our politicians any way back from a process that London and Dublin had marshalled actually quite well to that point.
Time Bomb was the last advert that Andy Wood was involved in. In May 1997, there was a new Labour government, a new Prime Minister.
Mr Blair said his priority was to secure a fair and lasting political settlement.
And a new Secretary of State for Northern Ireland.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, we're looking forward to it.
Molam very quickly let it be known that she thought the adverts were a waste of time and money. Not, I have to say, directly to me. She told a journalist who took some mischievous delight in telling me, this is what Molam thinks about your adverts. We'll leave it there, though. They did recuts and compilations. They didn't make many more, as I understand it. But I was off on gardening leave by then. Oops.
The high-budget campaigns and mini-dramas of the past may have been stopped, but in 1998, in the push towards the Good Friday Agreement, David Lyle and Julianne Bailey were commissioned to produce one last ad, Choices. It started with a stark reminder of the human cost of the Troubles.
It told people how many people had died since 1969. But whilst the ad ran, we updated that death toll. So I remember having to fly around, you know, to UTV with the new tape in those days and hand it over if someone else had died.
The ad was a compilation of previous campaigns. With an upcoming referendum, it was arguably the most political advert the Northern Ireland office ever made.
From the Northern Ireland office's point of view, this was the most important election that there ever had been in the history of Northern Ireland, and it was going to throw the kitchen sink at getting that agreement endorsed by people here.
It is worth noting, though, that that Choices ad used the same imagery, the same font and the same agency as the literature to go into every home around the Good Friday Agreement. I think that was deliberate, that subliminally people would link that Choices ad to the Good Friday literature.
I think in the ads, the government deliberately confused the Good Friday Agreement with peace. So if you were against the Good Friday Agreement or you were sceptical about it, you were against peace.
Quite a lot of people perceived it as political interference. It created a bad taste in the unions community. It certainly didn't in the nationalist community because the majority of them voted. But it was very close in the unions community, and I think it swayed people to vote against it.
I don't think that the vote itself was necessarily won on television, and certainly not on an advertisement. It wouldn't have represented anything crucial if it had just been there as part of it.
It's not a day for sort of sound bites. I feel the hand of history upon our shoulder.
After 30 years of violence and 2 years of intensive talks, the Good Friday Agreement was finally signed by politicians on the 10th of April, 1998.
This is it. This is the
You
agreement.
have it in your hand.
I have it in my hand.
I think, in a way, even the politicians were influenced by the adverts. If nothing else, it reaffirmed us in our sense that we had at least to give this a chance.
1 month later, the referendum held on both sides of the border resulted in a resounding yes.
The Yes campaign goes pop tonight, courtesy of local rock band Ash and U2's Bono.
Yes, 71.12%.
Over 25 commercials had run throughout the final 10 years of the Troubles. Here is the last one, Choices, released in March 1998.
The changing.
It's a bit of a shock when you see that figure.
It's really just showing all the heartbreak.
The terrible past we've had.
Yeah, I suppose proud is a justifiable word. I was proud to be associated with the making of them. I can think of very few other things I've done in the civil service which gave me that much satisfaction.
Well, it was quite audacious of them to go for essentially a peace process clip show with that ad. It's the agency's greatest hits.
This looks like some dreadful album from Telstar, you know, 1982.
Perhaps I'm the wrong person to be asking this question, but to me, from the community that I moved within, they would have had no effect whatsoever. I think they made the middle class people feel good. That's the type of culture and mentality and psyche that it sprung from.
You know, it's kind of like, okay, this is the end of the process, this is the end of something, and the start of something new.
It's very obvious that it's trying to sell something.
Even the greyhounds, they probably aren't going to race each other, just going to hug each other.
I think they can look back and say, yeah, we did a good job. We prepared ground which was worth preparing, because in the end, these ads did contribute to an atmosphere that allowed the peace to progress. And I think they can claim that.
The sun's come out, it's all going to be good.
Cats in the cradle and the silver spoon, little boy blue and the man on the moon. When you're coming home, son, I don't know when, but we'll get together then, Dad. We're gonna have a good time there.